This is an especial honor and a privilege for me. I am a proud graduate of the University of the West Indies, and it gives me immense pleasure to be tonight to do this on the occasion of the 70th anniversary of the UWI. Also, for reasons that I think you will discern by the end of this lecture, I believe that this is going to be, and I hope that this will be, the first of a series of lectures which will be of prime importance in the calendar of the intellectual calendar of Barbados for future years to come. As I say, that's the Confucius Institute lecture, I mean. And that is because, as I say, I think that you will see by the end of my lecture why I believe that this to be the case. In April last year, my wife Monica and I installed a solar photovoltaic generating system at our home in St. Joseph, tied to the Barbados Light and Power grid. We sell all the electricity we produce to BL&P, and we buy all the power we need from them, as we always have. At the end of the month, we usually have a small balance in our favor. We have power day and night, whether it's sunny or overcast, and our monthly electricity bill is zero. The price we paid for our system was about the same as our Toyota motor car. In effect, the price of a solar PV system in Barbados is now lower than the cost of the average new family car. That was not the case as recently as 10 years ago. What has made the difference is the entry of Chinese producers of solar PV panels into the international market, which rapidly increased production by several orders of magnitude. As everyone knows, if you produce on a massive scale, the costs of each unit you sell can be lower than for producers who have a smaller production capacity. Until Chinese producers entered the market, Germany was the main market for solar PV panels, because the German government, along with some Scandinavian countries, provided generous tax relief and rebates to encourage the purchase of PV panels. With only the relatively small German market to depend on, production facilities were relatively small, and the price for panels was relatively high, putting the cost of a system for domestic use beyond the reach of people like myself. That all changed when the Chinese government made a major commitment to the expansion of solar PV generation as part of China's push to diversify the Chinese economy away from fossil fuels. This immediately created a vastly expanded demand for PV because of the enormous size of the Chinese market. That, in turn, was an incentive for Chinese companies to ramp up production on a massive scale, with the resulting fall in the price of each unit. Here is an example of a virtuous economic cycle. China makes a decision, mainly in the best interest of their own environment and economy, to produce solar PV panels on a large scale. That reduces the selling prices of panels by so much that not only do Chinese consumers benefit, but many people in the rest of the world, including Barbados, are now able to afford a system which previously was beyond our means. This is a practical illustration of the benefits of trade between nations, and it also demonstrates how China benefits the Caribbean, along with all other countries in the international trading system, by making more affordable products widely available. The growth of Chinese industrial capacity has been a worldwide benefit. The most important event in the global economy in the 21st century has been the addition of 400 million Chinese industrial workers to the world's labor force. That is the implication of China's industrial revolution. Surprisingly, Western economies did not see the Chinese juggernaut coming. And economists in the West have been slow to recognize the full implications for the world economy, which are evident from the available indicators. Without China's manufacturing output over the last 3 decades, the world economy would now be much smaller, with fewer goods and services available to all. That has been of immense benefit to the Chinese workers who produce these goods. They have moved from lives of rural poverty to the security and promise of the middle class. Equally, it has been of great benefit to consumers in China and in the rest of the world, because the goods and services produced have been exported to the rest of the world as well as consumed in China. The reason China has been so successful at exporting is that they are able to sell products that give better value for money than similar products from other sources. We buy Chinese products because our money goes further when we do. Americans, Europeans, and people from other large diversified economies should welcome Chinese exports to their countries for that reason. They can buy local motor cars, cell phones, and printing services, but they choose to buy Chinese products instead because that enables them to have a somewhat better lifestyle. Like Germany, Japan, and Korea in earlier decades, Chinese products at first had a dubious reputation. But with the maturing of their industrial processes, Chinese products can now hold their own on quality with the industrial world. The concern in the US, Europe, and elsewhere about the Chinese trade surplus is entirely misplaced. By importing cheaper Chinese products and services that are nowadays every bit as good as they produce at home, Americans and Europeans are improving their lifestyles. What is more, the money that China earns from its export surplus is mostly invested in the US and Europe, which is an additional potential benefit to these industrial countries. The demise of the sunset industries in rich countries and the attendant loss of jobs is the result of new technologies and slow growth of labor productivity in these industries, which means that their labor costs are way higher than those in emerging markets which use the same modern technology but pay much lower wages. Small countries like those in the Caribbean do not face the dilemma of favoring Chinese imports over local production, because there are no local substitutes for the great majority of products we import from China. For our countries, the benefit of importing products and services of comparable quality from China in preference to more expensive sources is clear. The point to be made is that the greatest benefit to the Caribbean from Chinese economic growth comes from taking full advantage of the Chinese contribution to the global availability of goods and services. no action on the part of Caribbean governments is necessary. People of the region are availing themselves of the opportunities on their own initiative by importing from China and other affordable sources in Asia. As a result, there have been real gains in the quality of life and the access to goods and services throughout the region. China has been a catalyst in making the sun a practical natural resource. It used to be said that the islands of the Caribbean were poorly endowed with natural resources. Many people still think that to be true. But on the contrary, the Caribbean is richly endowed with resources which have been made valuable by the advance of technology. 50 years ago, the beaches, climate, natural beauty, and resort facilities of the Caribbean were not as valuable as they have now become, because in the era before there was commercial jet aircraft, the average middle-income earner in North America and Europe could not afford an overseas vacation. Our natural resources were always there, but they could only be monetized on a relatively small scale because the cost of travel was prohibitive, except for the very wealthy. Barbadians will be aware that tourism was a source of income for Barbados as early as the 18th century. Our earliest visitors, among them the very first American president and his older brother, came to Barbados literally for their health. However, up until the 1960s, only the very wealthy could afford a Caribbean vacation. Mr. Bill Malaloo, proprietor of the Malaloo Motor Museum, tells a marvelous tale from the 1930s of a wealthy English family who brought their automobile with them on the ship from their home in the UK, registered it with Barbadian plates for the 3 months they remained in Barbados, and then shipped it back when they left, together with their chauffeur, by the way. The Boeing 707 changed the face of travel and tourism and made the natural qualities of Caribbean resorts the basis for a tourism industry which has become the most important source of growth for the region. In very similar fashion, the affordable PV panel, which has become available thanks to China's entry into the world market as a leading producer, has converted the Caribbean's abundant sunshine into a usable natural resource. Every Caribbean country now has the possibility of replacing fossil fuels for all power needs using available, affordable technology. The sun, wind, or rivers and thermal springs have now become of immense value thanks to a number of new technological advances. These include more efficient wind turbines, computer programs and communications to permit thousands of small producers to join the national electric grid, cars, buses, and other transport run entirely on electricity, and storage systems to supply power when there is no wind or sunlight. China is already a game changer in one of these technologies by reducing the cost of PV to a level that makes it competitive with fossil fuels. And the Caribbean, along with the rest of the world, stands to reap immense benefit. The cost of wind turbines have moderated as well, thanks to Chinese output. Chinese production may also have a decisive impact on reducing the cost of battery storage systems an area where Chinese companies, along with Elon Musk, the founder of the Tesla Motor Company, and others, are making massive investments. The fact that practical, affordable technologies which are currently on the market can supply 100% of the power needs of the Caribbean from wind, the sun, and thermal sources has transformative potential for the Caribbean, which the region's leaders have yet to discern. Every Caribbean nation can now supply all the power it needs for the electric grid, for cars, cycles, buses, trucks, trains, construction equipment, cooking, and every other requirement from sources that are entirely free of cost and in infinite supply. In the words of the late Dr. Oliver Headley, the Caribbean's distinguished pioneer of solar photovoltaics, the sun will still shine when the oil runs out. And you don't have to pay to dig or pump it out of the ground. The Caribbean needs to wake up to the fact that every day our countries receive more free energy from the sun and the wind than we could possibly need. Until very recently, we lacked the technologies to make practical use of that free energy. Now, all these are available and affordable. The transformative potential of renewable energy for Caribbean economies cannot be overestimated. If the Caribbean had no need to import fossil fuels, the foreign exchange saved could be used to invest in additional capacity to produce goods and services and grow our economies. Since we do produce some fossil fuels in the region, this output could be exported, adding to foreign earnings and growth potential. What is more, these additional resources of foreign exchange would be available each and every year. The growth rate of every country would rise to a higher level permanently. Growth rates of the order of 5% or more might become the norm. However, progress towards this goal will take place rapidly only if governments in the region catch the vision and develop strategies which provide incentives in the right direction. In the absence of government direction, the enormous potential of renewable energy for the Caribbean may not be realized at all. The underlying message in this section of my essay is that China has played a pivotal role in creating for the Caribbean and countries worldwide the potential for a 100% switch from fossil fuels to renewable sources of power. Caribbean governments can take advantage by instituting appropriate policies and incentives for the transformation entirely without reference to China. China has provided the world with a huge external economy in economic terms, and it is up to Caribbean leaders to take advantage. The importance of understanding China. My first visit to China in 1980 remains as one of the turning points of my entire life. China was then an alien country to Western eyes in very obvious ways. Everyone, women and men, high officials and street cleaners, dressed in the same drab olive green uniform of tunic and slacks. Only high officials had the use of motor cars, large, black, and old-fashioned. Rush hour in Beijing featured traffic jams of cyclists, bicyclists, maybe a dozen abreast on Beijing's wide boulevards, following signals of policemen in elevated kiosks. Evidence of Western-style commerce was non-existent. Outside of major cities, One's fleeting glimpses were of rural lifestyles that were decidedly third world. What was it that hit me with the force of a life-changing revelation? It was the fact that these people, who have nothing of our culture, who share none of our beliefs, and have never been exposed to things we take for granted in our history and culture, are the majority of humankind. I have a National Geographic world map issued about a decade ago, which identifies the typical human being, the group which has the largest number of individuals on our planet. The answer is, and you would never have guessed it, a 30-something-year-old male Han Chinese. When I first visited China in 1980, that country was a bit player on the global scene. My wake-up call was therefore personally enlightening, revelatory even. But you could have argued that, while it enriched my life, it mattered little to Barbados, the Caribbean, or the rest of the world. That is demonstrably not the case today. It is vitally important that we all get to know China better, and absolutely essential that our leaders in government and politics, society, the economy and business, and our intellectual institutions get to know China intimately. China has taken its place in the forefront of global activity in every aspect of life. The countries, institutions, and individuals who understand China and the Chinese best are those who will do well in a world which is being largely shaped by Chinese economic policy and the reaction of the rest of the world to that policy. The better we understand China, and the greater our insight into the dynamic relationship between the new resurgent China and the rest of the world, the better we will appreciate the opportunities that may offer themselves to us to take advantage of the new currents in world affairs. Let me offer a personal example. A paradox of our interconnected world is that it is very difficult to get reasonably unbiased opinions about any global issue, much less anything that has to do with a major event or issue affecting the interest of a leading industrial country. That is because the sources of global information, both in the formal and on the social media, originate in the West. We see this bias most dramatically whenever the Olympics roll around. Only in very recent times, when the Caribbean set up its own sports network, have we had full coverage of Caribbean athletes' performances at the Olympics. Previously, if you watched British sources, you would see Caribbean athletes only on the periphery of coverage that focused on British athletes. Similarly, US athletes were the focus of US coverage, Canadians of Canadian coverage, etc. We do not normally think about it, but this same bias is reflected in all the news we receive. In order to better understand reality, you have to have the benefit of several different points of view. Arguably, the most important development in global journalism in the past few years seems to have gone unnoticed in journalistic sources. It is the establishment of the China Global Television Network, CGTN, a global network with the resources, personnel, and systems to offer a truly alternative worldview. The closest we had previously to an alternative view was Al Jazeera, but they grew out of our familiar Western tradition and as a result, show some Western biases. CGTN can truly live up to its slogan to see the difference, because its roots are in a different culture altogether. What makes CGTN especially powerful, in my view, is its global structure, with broadcast studios in Nairobi and Washington, D.C., as well as Beijing. As a result, the network offers the most insightful English language coverage of Africa and Latin America that is available to us in the Caribbean. Every morning at 6 Barbados time, CGTN airs a program entitled Africa Live, which is prepared and presented by the Nairobi studio. I have not found a more comprehensive program of Pan-African news anywhere, covering all aspects of African economy and society. In the evening Barbados time, CGTN's coverage shifts to the Washington, D.C. studio, covering North and South America in a balanced way, which no other network can match. If you want to know what is really making news in Latin America, the CGTN program, Americas Now, is unparalleled in its coverage in the English language. Understanding China ensures that we are not blindsided by changes in the global economy and international relations. This is very important for small countries like those in the Caribbean, because our economies are very sensitive to currents in world economies. Dramatic and far-reaching changes are taking place in the global economy and the relationship between nations. It is not at all clear where they will lead, but history may well record the current period as a watershed in the affairs of nations and peoples. Our countries need to be aware of the immensity of the changes because of their far-reaching consequences. I will mention just 3 examples of policies and events which have occurred in 2017, which it is essential that the Caribbean leadership make themselves aware of if they have not already done so. The first is President Xi Jinping's address to the world-famous Davos Forum in January 2017. That conference came hard on the heels of the inauguration of an unpredictable isolationist Donald Trump as President of the United States of America. Trump has effectively abdicated American leadership of world affairs. At Davos last year, without saying so in so many words, President Xi took up that mantle. His speech committed China to an active engagement with the world economy and to policies that were the outcome of global agreements in the UN and its organizations. It was a tectonic shift in global perceptions, which was immediately recognized by many perceptive commentators. I am not sure how many Caribbean leaders and leaders of opinion locally would have noticed. My second example is China's Belt and Road Initiative. China has officially embarked on an external program of investment, infrastructure, transport, and communications, which is without precedent in recent history. It is loosely based on the idea of a modern reinterpretation of the historic Silk Road that linked Europe and East Asia. President Xi has broadened the concept to include land and sea connections that include rail, road, and marine infrastructure, and it covers countries in Africa and Latin America, as well as Europe and Asia. In effect, the Silk Road now goes by sea as well as by land and covers a network of tributaries and associated links. It has been said that if only 1/3 of the projected activity takes place, China's economic reach would have broadened beyond recognition. What is more, investments that fall within the ambit of the Belt and Road are already underway or in place. The single-gauge railway linking the Kenyan capital of Nairobi to the port of Mombasa began operations last year. It is of major economic benefit to Kenya, Uganda, and South Sudan. The third event which the world needs to take account of is the Congress of the Communist Party of China held in Beijing in November last year. At that Congress, President Xi presented a vision of a new China where the prosperity which the country has achieved is consolidated and shared with all Chinese, and where decisive action is taken to address environmental challenges in China and the world as a whole. President Xi committed China to an active role in world affairs, acting through the UN and its agencies, as well as through institutions and cooperation agreements which China itself has initiated. At the Congress, the CPC fortified mechanisms for executing this grand strategy. President Xi's vision for China is breathtakingly ambitious. The risks are equally formidable, as many Western commentators have observed. The difficulties of realizing such a comprehensive program, requiring full engagement of tens of millions of leaders in politics, society, and business, at many different levels of the Chinese administration and society, are enormous. The chances for things to go wrong are multitude. There is, however, an important reason to be optimistic. It is that underlying the entire strategy is a Chinese economy that is set to continue growing at a steady clip. A growing economy offers scope to ensure that there are no losers, and there is never a need to rob Peter to pay Paul. So long as the Chinese economy continues to be driven by investment in new productive capacity, there will always be enough to ensure that everyone is better off. The key phrases of President Xi's discourse were the moderately prosperous economy and the initiatives to lift the last remaining 40 million Chinese out of poverty. Commerce and investment. Tourism is now the Caribbean's biggest export, so naturally, interest focuses on the potential demand from China. Here, I would advise that we tread cautiously. Year before last, I read in China Daily, China's leading English language newspaper, a news item on the impact of Chinese visitors on Fiji in the Pacific. The sheer numbers of visitors from China have overwhelmed Fiji's tourist accommodations and attractions, and the visitor experience in Fiji has deteriorated as a result. Truthfully, the Caribbean still has so much untapped demand among middle and upper income groups in the Americas and Europe that there is no reason to devote resources to the Chinese market. Instead, the Caribbean should focus on discrete marketing to the very top end of the market in China to attract the discriminating visitor of considerable means. A similar logic applies to branded Caribbean luxuries such as aged rum and Jamaican Blue Mountain coffee. Caribbean producers should eschew the popular market in favor of a strategy which targets the very wealthy. Chinese investment in the Caribbean is another topic which has excited much interest. The fact of the matter is that the Caribbean already attracts tremendous investor interest from countries and institutions that have always invested in our region. The region is awash with proposals to invest in new tourist accommodation, infrastructure, telecommunications, business services, construction, and other areas that are seen as profitable. Investor interest comes from private international sources as well as from regional and international institutions. What slows and often chokes off investment altogether is the inefficiency of Caribbean bureaucracies. The Caribbean countries are now all in the lower rankings of the Global Competitiveness Report and the Doing Business Report. And most Caribbean countries' external debt is now rated below investment grade. For many international investors, projects in the Caribbean that would otherwise have been profitable are no longer viable once risk premiums are factored in. Many other projects are hampered by delayed permissions, inconsistent incentive policies, and legal and administrative inefficiencies. My point is that there is no shortage of international investor interest in the Caribbean, and Chinese companies and official institutions are among the investors who are keen to take advantage of remunerative investments in our region. However, they face the same bureaucratic frustrations and inconsistencies as other investors, and as a result, we should not expect them to be any more successful than any other interested parties. One area with great potential for commerce with China is traded services other than tourism. These include legal, financial, marketing, design, communications, and administrative services. Companies that have a global reach make strategic choices as to the location both of their production facilities and of the services that support production and worldwide distribution. Caribbean countries boast regulatory systems that are kept on par with international guidance from the IMF, World Bank, the Basel Committee on Bank Supervision, and other supervisory bodies. The region's financial systems are fully integrated into global financial markets through international hubs in London, New York, and elsewhere. These are key elements in attracting traded services to the Caribbean to support the activities of firms which produce and sell in many countries. Now that China has become the world's second largest economy and the world's biggest market for automobiles and other items, there would seem to be a market for providing services to Western companies trading with China. This opportunity seems to be largely untapped. Another exciting possibility for future Caribbean-Chinese economic linkage is in the area of financial technology. I believe that recent breakthroughs in financial technology will revolutionize the way the world affects payments and settles transactions in directions that none of us have yet imagined. I have written a short article on this topic, which you may find on the website of the Bretton Woods Committee. Chinese firms and entrepreneurs are world leaders in new payment technologies. And the Caribbean boasts a wealth of tech-savvy young entrepreneurs with an interest in this area. One Barbadian company is doing pioneering work in financial technology. Regional regulators should be proactive in supporting and promoting these entrepreneurs, as they can provide the Caribbean with greater presence in the international market of ideas. Inevitably, this will bring us closer to China and to Chinese approaches to the use of financial technology. How may the Caribbean maximize benefits from China's economic growth? The basic message of this essay is that the Caribbean benefits from China's economic success simply by following sound macroeconomic policies. The key elements of a sound macroeconomic strategy are policies to sustain external competitiveness and to maintain a balance of external payments with adequate foreign exchange reserves. The Caribbean, along with the rest of the world, benefits from the reduction in global inflation, which has come about as a result of the growth in China's production capacity. Sound policies ensure that countries reap full benefits. The Caribbean has an opportunity to accelerate a program to switch to renewable sources of power thanks to Chinese investment in solar PV and the coming surge in production of large-scale battery storage units. Caribbean countries have been slow to embrace the potential of renewable energy. Barbados is the only country to have announced a target of 100% renewables, and that vision is not yet reflected in a deliberate and internally consistent strategy. Here is an opportunity that is now open to the Caribbean, in large part due to Chinese commitment to combat climate change. It is up to the Caribbean to institute policies to take advantage. My third point is that the Caribbean should take full advantage of every avenue for getting to know China better. The establishment of Confucius Institutes in the region opens a major avenue for Caribbean people to deepen their knowledge of China and the Chinese. The Chinese Global Television Network is highly recommended. For those who do not have cable TV access, the CGTN programs are available online. There are many opportunities for cultural exchanges, education, and training offered by Chinese national, state, and municipal authorities. Chinese embassies in the Caribbean are collaborating with Caribbean institutions and Chinese communities to bring Chinese culture to our region. Joint programs and collaborative research activities between Chinese and Caribbean academic institutions are other vehicles through which we can enlighten ourselves about the lives and worldviews of the world's most populous nation. And the principal alluded to some of the things that KFIL is doing in this direction. Forward-thinking Caribbean people are already on board and discovering new realities about our world from Chinese perspectives. Many who have done so are already benefiting through access to Chinese products and services, networking, job opportunities, access to new technologies, and investment opportunities. Sadly, by and large, the region's leadership has not yet caught the vision. This, to my mind, is our most urgent need. Visionary leadership that takes a long view and invests in deepening their understanding of China's growing presence in our changing world. I have had relatively little to say about trade and investment. There is really no need to. If you think about it, there is no shortage of funding for Caribbean projects that are seen to be profitable or for projects in infrastructure or renewable energy. So long as Caribbean countries maintain sound policies, Chinese investors will come knocking along with those from the Americas, Europe, and elsewhere. Equally, we can attract all the tourists we can accommodate and export all the competitive products we produce, so long as we give value for money. Discriminating Chinese consumers will find our products and services through appropriate networks and high-end global marketing. my concluding remarks. Small open economies like those of the Caribbean are especially sensitive to the external environment in which they exist and with which they interact. As many small nations have demonstrated, this does not diminish their chances of prosperity compared to large countries. What makes the difference in countries large and small are policies tailored to the country's circumstances. In the case of small countries, external circumstances loom much larger than in larger countries. The emergence of China as a leading global powerhouse is the most significant international development of the 21st century. The Caribbean, along with the rest of the world, already reaps benefits from Chinese production and exports. With sound economic policies and strategies to accelerate the use of renewable energy, we can reap greater benefits. Furthermore, as we get to know China better, and Chinese investors and consumers learn more of the exceptional products, experiences, and investment opportunities the Caribbean offers, new opportunities will open up, further enhancing the region's growth potential. Thank you.
All right. I'm sure everyone enjoyed that lecture just like how I did. I have lots of notes here after that lecture. What we're going to do this evening is just take a couple questions for Delisle. What I would encourage you to do, we have mics set up. So we could, you can get your questions together. Oh, we have someone roving around the room.
Good evening, Doctor. Good evening, Dr. Worrel. You're hearing me, right? Because I can't hear myself. Okay. Yes. I'm not going to, like Dr. Moore, claim connection with Dr. Worrel, although I could. I am going to tell you that this has been an enormously educational experience. I am very happy that I have gotten an opportunity to hear you behind the mic instead of your work in getting Barbadians to hear others behind the mic through the lecture that the Central Bank gives every year in November, the Winston Scott Lecture. I'm extraordinarily pleased that you are behind the mic and able to talk to us. And I want, as a poet, to say this, to ask you to consider this. The first thing that you started with that struck me was that policies when you do policies that, when you create policies in your own interest, in the interest of your own people, your own self, that it offers great advantage to how you move in the rest of the world. And I'm sitting there thinking it is very difficult for us to create policies in our own interests in the Caribbean because of our size. So this is your area. I came across, just my final statement before I ask the question, I came across a saying by Confucius when I visited China, in Hong Kong, China, in 2007. Confucius says, one of the sayings, many, you love the sheep, I love the ceremony. You love the sheep, I love the ceremony. Now, if we are thinking of the ceremony being where you sacrifice the sheep, he's saying, you love the sheep, I love the ceremony. I love the sheep. I love the sheep dearly. And I am wanting to be more convinced that as small countries, we can make policy committed to our interests, when faced by a juggernaut of the size of China, where the woman who made these earrings for me yesterday told me she worked at the port in Bridgetown, where they were told to take the labels off the cultural products that are saying Barbados, take the China label off. I want you to speak to that. Thank you.
Okay. Could we have one more question before we turn it over to Delisle? I'll give you some time to gather your questions. I have one question for Delisle that maybe might be related to that one. So, throughout the entire, well, coming on to the end of the lecture, you noted the tremendous potential for Caribbean products to penetrate the Chinese market and for us to sell niche products to China. What is so different about China relative to, say, North America or Latin America? There's always been this recommendation from Caribbean economists that if you can just grab a small portion of the North American market or the Latin American market, we could boost growth tremendously in the Caribbean. Why is it that we haven't been able to capture that small piece of the market in the United States or Latin America for our products? But you think that we can maybe capture that piece of the market in China? What is so different about those two markets?
Okay, so, yeah. So first, Margaret, the reason we know that size is not a constraint is that you have some very small economies, which are some of the richest nations in the world, okay? So the population of Iceland is about the same size as the population of Barbados, right? And Iceland is number 9 in the Human Development Index. The 9th, in terms of the quality of life, it is the country that ranks number 9 in the whole world, right? And so let me give you the answer is that you have to have appropriate policies, right? You must not try to replicate the policies of rich countries. Let me give you an example which is close to my heart: food security. The way to have food security in Barbados is to have adequate foreign exchange reserves, so that if there is a problem with the supply of food, you can buy it from wherever it is available. You cannot have food security by producing your own food because of the size of the country and because of where our country sits. We cannot actually produce adequate numbers of staples, the staple foods that we eat and that guarantee the quality of our diet. We cannot produce them in Barbados. And those that we can produce are expensive to produce. The reason they're expensive to produce is because we are a relatively well-to-do country, and producing things in well-to-do countries is an expensive business. And that is why the products that we sell have to be targeted at relatively wealthy people. Okay? That applies to our tourism, to everything we do. We benefit because as our own lifestyles improve, so we are now a middle-class society. When I was, in 1945, when I was born, there was no middle class, okay? There was rich people and poor people. I was a product of the lower middle class, and what that meant was that we had piped water in the yard. We didn't have electricity. Okay? So now we have transformed this economy, and we have a middle class. And the middle class and many of the middle class, maybe of ours, can afford what to the Barbadian of the 1940s and 50s were luxuries. So there is a possibility for local consumption of local products, but it is not going to be the mass consumption. Mass consumption. So just to give you that as an example of appropriate policies. in response to Winston's comment, you know, in the Caribbean, we do not have a problem of demand. There are infinite number of people wanting to consume every amount, all the products that we can possibly produce, so long as we give value for money. The reason that Ammon Hotel went out of business was because it was not giving value for money. It was selling, it was the cheapest thing on the block. They had lots of bargains and so on, but people were not getting value for their money. And, you know, that's the real answer. So, you know, I'm saying that we don't have to go out of our way to get tourists from China. We will get discriminating tourists from everywhere in the world if we have resorts like Sandy Lane and like Port Ferdinand, which get a reputation around the world. Because in those circles, people will want to come to those places and to have those experiences. And the beauty of the Caribbean is that not only in Barbados, but everywhere in the Caribbean, there are unique experiences. There are experiences that you can only get. There is only one St. Nicholas Abbey.
Dr. Worrel, that was a really inspiring lecture. My question tonight is, how do we get local firms to have enough vision or to see the potential that China holds in regards to increasing their bottom line? Dr. Worrel, you've recommended that we can exploit potential demand in China to increase output in the Caribbean. So if there's a demand for juices, maybe we can fill that niche. But there is still the supply problem in the Caribbean. So what I am asking is, what can we do to help local manufacturers, local businesses, to not only see the potential benefits, but to exploit any potential opportunities, you know, tackling the supply side? Okay.
All right, thanks a lot.
Also, my second question relates to the issues from the side of the government. Forgive me if I'm wrong, but I believe there's still a fundamental role for government to help companies in regards to exploiting these niche areas, not only in terms of market research, but also incentives that would be necessary for companies. So what do you see as government's roles, in regards to helping companies exploit the potential opportunities in China?
Okay. All right. Should we take those two questions?
Sure. Important questions. And on the first one, it is important to understand that the problem in the Caribbean is not with the firms. We have competitive firms, not every firm, but you know, the beauty of a market economy is that if you're not competitive, you go to business. The people that survive are the people who are competitive. And we have some exceptionally competitive firms. We have entrepreneurs, rich, middle, and poor, and old and young. So we have mature institutions. I'm not going to begin any call any names, but we all know the names of the successful enterprises in Barbados and in the Caribbean that have been able to garner a world market. Okay, and you know, I spoke of our aged rums and so on. Those are more than sufficient to drive our economies. Their problem relates to your second question, and that is the enabling environment and the support and facilities that the public sector needs to provide. And so, you know, I always refer people to the Global Competitiveness Report put out by the World Economic Forum, because it is, I think, clearly the most comprehensive assessment of the things that drive investment and success in the international market for countries around the world. And if you look at Barbados's report, the index for Barbados in that report, Barbados is still, there are only 4 countries in the Caribbean that are actually assessed in the report, and Barbados is still the most competitive of them, with the one with the highest index. But Barbados has lost ground. It has slipped from number 47 in the global rankings, which was quite respectable, to number 72, which is not respectable. And the analysis is broken down by different categories. There are things like institutional strength. There are the macroeconomic indicators. There are indicators of the strength of your financial markets, your labor markets, your educational and social services, technology, communications, all the things that go into the mix when investors are deciding where do they want to locate their subsidiaries. And you know the reason why we have slipped from 47 to 72 is because of 2 factors. One are macroeconomic indicators, the fiscal deficit that keeps growing, the mountain of debt, and it is bad debt, it is not good debt. There is good debt. Good debt results in acquisition of assets. So you borrowed and you can see what you have borrowed for. We have borrowed just to keep the doors open. That is very bad debt. And that is debt that has cost, that puts us in a very difficult economic situation today, unnecessarily so. And the second thing that has caused the deterioration in our competitiveness is a declining confidence in the delivery of public services. So I urge all of you to go online, to download the Global Competitiveness Report. You can download it for free, and to sort of look at the analysis. And if you want a quick assessment, every month I put out an economic letter on my webpage, and I believe it's in August of last year. You have to check the actual month. I don't remember exactly the month, but I did do an analysis of the Barbados report in which I highlighted the things that needed to be addressed. So our problem in Barbados has nothing to do with the private sector. On the basis of the private sector's competitiveness, the economy should have grown last year by about 3%. It didn't grow because investment did not take place, entirely because of problems related to public sector inefficiency.
All right. Could we take another round of questions, if there are any more? You have one right in the middle.
Good evening, Dr. Delisle. Yes, 2 years ago, and the Chinese leader and the Xi president gave us a proposal that we called One Belt and One Road. And what's your purpose of this proposal? And 2 years ago, China also built up the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. And the BRIC country take part in this bank. And yes, I want to know whether Barbados has the attitude to become a member of this bank. Yes, and 2 questions. Thank you very much.
Okay. Next question, right across.
If I may, thank you very much for a very enlightening presentation, Dr. Worrel. You touched on one subject which can be very important to accelerate growth in the region, which is the opportunity of using renewable energy sources. Now, we all know the resources are very good. China helped us bring down the costs, so it's a bargain these days. And you said the leadership in the region is still slow picking that up. Why do you think are they so slow picking up on that opportunity, which can actually increase growth rates by 1, 2, maybe 3%?
Okay. Is there one more question before I pass it back to Delisle? Just one more at the front. No. Right, straight down at the front.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Just taking up from the question from the previous person, precisely on the issue of the government and the Caribbean government's position. Because to me, it seems throughout your presentation, I saw that there was a frustration with the absence of a Caribbean government policy with respect to China. So I would like to know, what exactly do you think, what more can the governments do, if you can expand on that? Because yes, we have governments who have taken decisions to establish missions in China. You have where they're working with, we're meant to have the Confucius Institute so that they understand the need to have their citizens learn Chinese, because presumably they understand the importance of China. I think you also mentioned the investment, the private sector can work in these areas. Government is thinking about it, but you think, I seem to get from you that you think it's still not enough. What precisely, or give us some ideas, what governments can do, what more can they do in this regard, in respect of policy towards China?
Great, thanks a lot. Delisle?
Okay, so in respect to the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, that is an important initiative, and also there is also the New Development Bank, which is the so-called BRICS Bank, which has also resulted from Chinese initiative. Both of these are vitally important funding institutions. As far as I know, Barbados has not joined either at this point in time, but I think that that is understandable because, as I said, our problem at the moment is not a problem of finance. And you know, in the nature of things, global banks of this magnitude initially are going to focus on larger countries, and since we have, as I intimated in my lecture, more than adequate financing available to us for the things that we need to be doing in all areas, in infrastructure, in communications, in whatever, tourism, whatever. Our problem really is not the availability of finance. It's not a lack of interest on the part of investors. Our problem, and also even in terms of affordable finance. So international institutions, regional institutions are willing and able. Our problem is the implementation. Our problem is the local capacity to get the permissions out, to get the necessary approvals and so on, to get the licensing and so on. So that's, I think, the reason why there has not been an initiative to move in that direction of joining the banks. But I think it will come in due course. But as I say, we've got to get the public sector bureaucracy up to international standards before we get there. Which brings me to the question of leadership. This is a crucial one. I can answer both questions together. Leadership is about having a vision. It is not about going through the motions. So much of what we do in the Caribbean, so much of the policies that we lack conviction. People do them because it is the right thing to do. they enter into agreements, and CARICOM really, my greatest disappointment with the CARICOM arrangements is that people enter into agreements which they really have no commitment to, and which they really don't really expect to achieve. You know, the CSME is the epitome of that. You know, the Caribbean has no emotional commitment to a single market. They say that that is our ultimate goal, but it's not believable. And the same is true of everything we do. And I think that the only way that we can overcome that I can see that we can overcome that, is through the agency of things like this, lectures like this, and you know, those of us who have the vision and who have the conviction, working as hard as we can and just keeping that message going. And we have got to have, you know, we have got to be realistic. You know, you can't get to, you know, utopia. You can never get to utopia, but you can't get to even achievable goals if just by putting them down on a piece of paper. You have got to have a strategy which is implementable, which you believe and which you can see is that you can actually do. And as soon as you put that strategy in place, then you must take deliberate steps to measure your progress towards that goal. And we never do that. You know, for years we have had a strategy of bilingualism in our schools. And it goes nowhere. And that is the same thing that is the source of my frustration. We say that we are committed to renewable energy. But then we do things that are inconsistent with that goal. We have no action plan for achieving that goal. It happens if it happens. And that is the same with our engagement with China. And so you have progress because committed individuals and committed institutions take whatever initiative they can. But it doesn't come together. And in the end, it is not durable because the top leadership does not have that vision. And we just have to keep working on it until leaders, real leaders, emerge in this region.
Thanks a lot, Delisle. I think that is a good point to end on.